So we're picking this up. This is the second part of Unit 3, American Empire. And we'll start off, just sort of just briefly take a look at this picture because I think that this magazine cover from an old magazine called Judge. This was from 1899, July of 1899. Really, it kind of gives you a good idea of what we're going to be talking about here. Now, let's also be honest that this magazine cover would never, ever fly in today's world. It's incredibly insensitive. The weird little Filipino baby thing here. Let me go get my. Oops, wrong one. Wrong one again. Laser pointer. Okay. The creepy little Filipino baby, the Cuba baby kid, the Puerto Rican baby kid, um, the president bathing and cleaning the savage Filipino in the waters of civilization. Um, yeah, there's a lot that's wrong with this, but it leads us into what we're going to be talking about, and that is the development of an American empire. So let's open up looking at 1896. Now, if you guys remember when we had talked about the World's Fair, 1896 was the next year of the presidential election cycle. And the World's Fair, when it ended in 1893, late 1893, early 1894, let's roll into, you had a whole bunch of issues that developed. You came out of the World's Fair, this great event where people were feeling great about being Americans and optimism and hope, and the White City itself ended up burning down, largely due to the presence of anarchists, mass unemployment after the fair was over, the continuing panic of 1893 caused by the issue of silver and gold, the smallpox epidemic that broke out, killing people, the change in crime with the discovery of H.H. Holmes. America is a very different place at the end of the fair. And the president at the time, Grover Cleveland, was absolutely fed up and disgusted with his party and with where America seemed to be going. And as a result, we have in 1896 a brand new election where we have two new candidates to look at. Now, it's kind of hard, I think, for us to really imagine, but back in the 1890s, even up until the early 1900s, the president of the United States was not even the guy in charge of his own political party. The parties were actually run by lifelong political hacks and sort of shady backroom guys who bankrolled and paid the bills of the parties. Maybe it's not that dissimilar from now, depending on how you want to look at it. For the Republicans, the man in charge of their party was an Ohio businessman and former senator named Mark Hanna. He was the real power and controller of the Republican Party. He made or broke candidates. And he selected early on Senator William McKinley of Ohio to be the next Republican candidate and president of the United States. And McKinley was a brilliant, brilliant choice in many respects. He had support from businesses, largely because McKinley is the guy who created the McKinley tariff, if you remember, the highest tariff in American history. So he had the support of business and bankers. He was also a big supporter of the gold standard. But interestingly enough, McKinley had been a trial attorney in Cleveland, where he was from, where he had gotten a lot of street cred with workers because he had represented skilled labor against business and won. So McKinley appealed to both business and labor. The Republican platform, that's the things that their candidates stood on, what their parties wanted. The gold standard. Yeah, never mind the fact that Harrison and his silver policy, and Harrison was a Republican, is what caused the problems. The Republicans are back on the gold standard, baby. Their flirtation with progressive ideas on that respect are gone. Tariffs. That William McKinley, he knows tariffs. He had mentored under President Rutherford B. Hayes. He had been a senator. He had proposed tariffs. McKinley knew all about tariffs. He had experience and had connections in government. Expansion of America. We had already helped Hawaii to overthrow its queen. We were now looking to actually formally absorb Hawaii as a U.S. territory. In addition, we wanted to somehow acquire, by takeover, whatever, some islands in the Caribbean, as well as building a canal through Central America. The Republicans also championed voting rights for women and continued civil rights improvements for blacks. They wanted the restriction of uneducated immigrants. If you were educated or well off or a middle class immigrant, they were okay with you, but otherwise, they don't want immigrants coming in. In a very un American, maybe certainly un George Washington like stand, the Republican Party openly called for the support of rebels in Cuba who were fighting the Spanish and rebels in the obscure uh, territory in Asia Minor known as Armenia, who were fighting against the Ottoman Turks for their freedom. And the Whereas Washington had said stay out of other people's business and affairs and wars and everything, the Republicans wanted America to officially become involved as supporting and acknowledging both the Cubans and the Armenians in their struggles. Last but not least, the Republicans wanted to set up a labor board that would have negotiations between business and labor and avoid violence or problems with that. Mark Hanna, by the way, some of you may not be able to see this, but this is Mark Hanna. Pasty looking and squishy. This is Poppin' Fresh, the Doughboy. I'm serious. You take this hat and put it on Mark Hanna, you'd have the Pillsbury Doughboy. I'm just saying. Okay. Love me some Doughboy. On the flip side, the Democrats are nowhere near as unified as the Republicans. There is nobody in the Democratic Party who is strong enough to manipulate a candidate to getting chosen. You have a divided party that meets in Chicago in 1896 for their convention. The Northern and Eastern Democrats, who are referred to as the Gold Democrats, are the conservatives, like Grover Cleveland. They actually want to renominate Grover Cleveland. For his part, Cleveland gives them the not nice finger and says, no, ain't going to do that, and refuses to accept a nomination even if they give it to him. The Western and Southern Democrats favor a bimetallic standard. Their support base comes largely from the poor, small rural farmers, and Western homesteaders. So a lot of their support is the Ku Klux Klan. And these two groups don't get along with each other. 2/3 of the convention has to vote for somebody to give a candidate the nomination. They can't get one. The Gold Democrats even go so far as to refuse to participate in the voting, but because they're there and they're being counted, they need them to make a quorum. They have the quorum. They need to actually, be able to get a majority. 5 rounds of voting without really any success. Now, this is where we enter with William Jennings Bryan, a 36-year-old representative from Nebraska. Now, keep in mind, if you guys can remember, the minimum age to run for president is 35. So he's only a year above minimum age. Bryan has one thing going for him, really, and that is he is an incredibly gifted speaker. And the first 3 rounds, nobody knows who he is, nobody cares, but he gets around and he starts meeting people and talking with them, and his rhetoric and his oratory skills get him noticed. So that by the time that round 5 comes around, Bryan has enough support to win the nomination. And he delivers an acceptance speech that is one of the most famous political statements in American history. It is known as the Cross of Gold speech, where he compares the gold standard to the crucifixion of Christ. Probably not necessarily the best way to influence people, but it was a powerful speech. So make sure you read that and you answer the questions about the Cross of Gold speech. So the election. The election features William McKinley for the Republicans against William Jennings Bryan for the Democrats. It's an all William election. William McKinley, by the way, McKinley and Sam the Eagle. McKinley actually was the basis for Sam the Eagle, but yeah, notice the steely eyes with the giant brow. Steely eyes, giant brow. Yeah. So William McKinley against William Jennings Bryan. And yes, he kind of looks normal. A couple people kind of pointed out it kind of looks like Tom Hanks, kind of does. The campaign itself is really a remarkable transition to a modern style of political campaigning. Mark Hanna runs everything for McKinley. McKinley doesn't even leave his house. He stays at home in his Ohio house. Every Sunday, he comes out on the front porch and gives a speech to anybody who happens to be there. If you want to go hear McKinley, go to his house. Mark Hanna does something very different. He approaches businessmen and bankers and entrepreneurial industrialists and says, look, my boy is the one who's going to be helpful for you. But in order for my boy to win, he's going to need a little bit of something. So how about ponying up something for the campaign? This is really a very modern idea that you begin hitting up people, big donating groups to sponsor your campaign and to pay off what it is that you need. Hanna was so successful that the Republicans outsprint the Democrats 5-1. So that means like for every dollar the Democrats spent on advertising and campaigning, the Republicans spent $5. That's largely because businesses and banks saw McKinley as in their best interest, which if you read The Cross of Gold, it'll give you some reason why they would have thought that. Now, one of the reasons why McKinley didn't leave his home to campaign was, number one, presidents just didn't do that. Number two, McKinley's wife suffered from severe epilepsy, and McKinley was genuinely afraid that she would die if she was left alone or if she was forced to travel around with him. The media, which loved William McKinley, largely because Mark Hanna had manipulated this support, the media portrays McKinley as being a devoted, loving husband who's going to treat America the same way he treats his sick wife. Bryan is portrayed as being dangerous to American business and prosperity, that he's a wild card, he's a populist, he's going to stir up the masses against big business, and he can't be trusted. Bryan, for his part, actually runs for 3 different political parties. He is the nominee for the Democrats, the nominee for the populists, who remember are essentially socialists, and he's also the nominee for a splinter group of Republicans known as the Silver Republicans. They all nominate him for president with a different guy for vice president. Whereas McKinley's base of support are businesses, industrialists, entrepreneurs, skilled workers, and upper middle class farmers, Bryan is supported by the unskilled worker, the lower class poor, the rural farmers, and the people of the West. Anybody who could benefit from inflation and silver were people who supported Bryan. Bryan attacked McKinley as being a puppet of Mark Hanna, which maybe in some respects he was. And he traveled across the country giving speeches. Now, what's different about this is, number one, this is normally not something that candidates did. They did not give speeches themselves. Number two, Bryan didn't bother to hit certain areas. He accepted the fact that the North and the East were going to vote Republican, and he knew that the South was going to vote Democrat. He concentrated specifically on the 4 states that kept switching their votes, the swing states. So this is the first time that candidates deliberately start targeting swing states and make in-person visits to attempt to influence them on how to vote. Now, McKinley admitted that if the campaign was simply about personality and about the ability to articulate well, Bryan should win. Bryan was an incredibly gifted speaker. McKinley, kind of boring and, creepy looking. But what Hanna did was, and this is also a modern idea, you shift the focus onto a weakness of the enemy and you hammer that weakness. And in this case, that was his experience. And, specifically in the area of tariffs. McKinley can talk about tariffs with experience and with authority because he's made them and he worked for a president. Bryan can do really nothing of the sort. All he can talk about is what is good for his home state and his ideas about the cross of gold. That's really it for him. McKinley easily wins the election, which is going to set us up for tomorrow looking at the development of a conflict with Spain. So that's the end of it for the notes for today. Just make sure you have everything and make sure you read the Cross of Gold speech and keep up with that, okay? Peace and love.